right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Jennifer Splansky-Jester, and I'm Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum. Today, we have a terrific program lined up for you, and we will be reviewing the results of the recent research study when collective impact has an impact. Today's program is 90 minutes long, and thanks for sticking with us for a great session. We want to hear from you as we go, and in order to do that, we have a few different polls sprinkled throughout the webinar, and we encourage you to ask questions as we go. The webinar will be recorded, and the slides will be available after the event, so do stay tuned for an email announcement with those details after we wrap up. If you have any questions of the technical sort during our webinar, feel free to use the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner of your interface, or you can send questions to our colleague Tracy Timmons-Gray, whose email is on the screen right now. Let's go to the next slide. So we are so excited to have the opportunity today to speak with the research team who conducted the recent study on collective impact. Our role at the Collective Impact Forum is to provide capacity building through resources and tools and trainings for practitioners and others engaged in collective impact to help you all accelerate your work and achieve outcomes in your communities. And we always are asking people, what can we do to help you advance your work? And one of the questions that we kept hearing from the field was, what are you learning about when collective impact has an impact? What type of change are people seeing in their communities, and how is collective impact contributing to that change? And while there were many different sites that had independent evaluations conducted and a few national networks that have been doing cross-site evaluation, there hadn't been a cross-site field-wide study to look at the impact collective impact was having more broadly. So the Collective Impact Forum, with philanthropic support, framed the question, to what extent and under what conditions does the collective impact approach contribute to systems and population level change? And then we were delighted to commission a team from ORS Impact and the Spark Policy Institute to conduct the study. And I think we struck a chord. We had over 1,000 people, actually over 1,200 people register for this webinar. And so we hope that this study and its findings are really useful for you all who are doing work out in your communities. So finally, before handing it over to the team from ORS and Spark, I do want to be clear about the focus of today's session. Today's webinar is not a primer on the collective impact approach or a 101 on how to implement it. The expert research team we have with us today will be speaking to the findings of the study itself. So as a result, please focus your questions, which we definitely encourage, on the study and its findings. Robert, let's go to the next slide. And for those with burning collective impact questions, we suggest that you check out resources on the Collective Impact Forum. We have an Introduction to Collective Impact page. There are actually several collective impact implementation-oriented webinars that you can find here. And so we are delighted to focus today on the research study and point you to other resources. Finally, we also have 3 handouts that you can download during the session. There's a link to them on the right-hand side of your screen. We have the slides from today's study, as well as what I like to call our cheat sheets, or one-pagers on the study overview and the headline findings, as well as a summary of findings related to the deep dive topics that the research team will touch on today related to implementation of collective impact, system change, and equity. Okay, well, it is so exciting and my pleasure to introduce our main presenters for today, the team from Spark and ORS. First, we have Terri Akey. Terri is a director at ORS Impact, where she leads system evaluation projects and helps clients build evaluation capacity. For this study, Terri was the project director and focused on equity-focused actions and outcomes as an area of the work. Next, we have Dr. Lauren Gase. She is a senior researcher at Spark Policy Institute. She has expertise in quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research and evaluation, having led a number of studies at the national and local levels to improve health, educational, and social outcomes. And then finally, we have Stachowiak, from the CEO of ORS Impact. where Sarah's been working for over 15 years on some of the most complex and messiest projects for the company's clients. For this study, Sarah had a particular focus on answering the contribution question using the process tracing methodology, which is something she will talk about today during our webinar. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Lauren to kick us off.
Great. Thanks so much, Jen, and thank you everyone for joining us here to hear a little bit about the study, When Collective Impact Has an Impact. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to start off with a poll, and Jen, you can go ahead and launch that poll to help us understand folks' level of familiarity with the study. So this is a multiple choice poll. Go ahead and check all that apply about your level of familiarity with the study. As you're completing it, I'm just going to orient you briefly on how we're going to spend our time together. We're going to start off by providing a brief overview of the study methods. Then we're going to present and discuss results in 3 chunks: impacts, including systems change, CI implementation, and equity. So within each of those areas, we're going to provide space for polling and questions. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some implications. So let's go ahead and close the poll and see if results are coming up. Okay, great. So this is great to see. It seems like most folks are in the bucket of this being sort of a great introduction to the study. Perfect. Helpful. Okay, so we can go ahead and go to the next slide, where I'll just go ahead and start off with some level setting. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide as well. So in 2011, John Kania and Mark Kramer published an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review laying out collective impact. And this is an approach for solving social problems at scale. The article laid out 5 conditions for structuring multi-sector collaboration. And I've provided those here on the slide so you can see them. So for some, the introduction of this defined framework for cross-sector collaboration provided a useful way to focus new and existing partnerships toward a common goal and hopefully foster greater impact. Based on its promise, many resources have been directed toward using this approach. So there's definitely been an increased uptake of the collective impact approach. But until now, the approach really has not been rigorously assessed. So as Jen mentioned, early last year, the Collective Impact Forum hired ORS Impact and Spark Policy Institute to conduct an in-depth study of collective impact. So as you can see on the next slide, the study was really designed to address 5 primary questions oriented around when and how collective impact approaches lead to system and population level change. In addition, we had some secondary questions that really focused on exploring how collective impact was being deployed, including the 5 conditions and the principles, as well as the context, challenges, and barriers that initiatives were experiencing. So on the next slide, you can see that the sample included 25 collective impact initiatives. These were selected from over 200 nominations. We selected sites based on a few characteristics. First, they had to be mature in their operation. So we looked for sites that had been implementing the approach for at least 3 years. In addition, they had to be implementing the collective impact conditions. Among these 25, we examined 8 of the sites in more depth via site visits to rigorously test the approach's contribution to the demonstrated population change. And then we examined 3 of the sites in more depth to better understand the equity work in the collective impact context. So on the next slide, I briefly have a little bit here about the methods. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail here since I want to jump right into the meat of the results. But just to mention briefly, with all 25 sites, we conducted in-depth interviews and document review, With the 8 sites where we looked at the contribution a little bit deeper, we did site visits and a variety of interactive dialogues with stakeholders. For the 3 equity sites, we had virtual focus groups around equity practices and outcomes. We used a variety of analytic methods. One of the important methods that I want to point out here are the rubrics, and these are one of the I think most useful products to come out of the study. Is we developed rubrics to assess implementation of collective impact as well as equity, system change, and population change. And we'll come back to these rubrics in some of our later discussion. They can be useful tools, I think, for those implementing and evaluating collective impact initiatives. We also use process tracing as well as thematic analysis. The last piece to mention quickly was that the study was informed by both an advisory committee and a steering committee. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sarah to launch us into our first section of the findings.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Well, it's so exciting to get to share these findings with you today, especially since so many of you are really new to learning about the study. I will just share this big process resulted in about a 120-page report. So we want to share some of the key highlights with you, but no, there's a lot more richness. We can only kind of scratch the surface today. The other thing is, in addition to the interactive polls, we'll also have some Q&A as we go through each of the major sections, as well as at the end. So you'll get a chance to ask us some questions as we go along, rather than just listening for 90 whole minutes. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide. So to be able to do this study and to answer this question of really understanding whether collective impact had contributed to population level changes, we needed some kind of model and framework to kind of anchor our work upon. And so we have this very simple picture of, on the right-hand side, you can see population level change. And this is everything from changes in river health and graduation rates and rates of homelessness. And then we wanted to work backwards and see what really contributed to those changes happening. So we looked for changes in systems. So these were changes that happened within or across organizations. We also looked at early changes, where we saw things like changes in collaborations and partnerships that could contribute to system changes happening on the ground. And we also looked to see at the degree to which collective impact conditions were being implemented and how well they were being implemented and how they contributed to those kinds of changes. Now, before we dive into the findings, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to take another little poll. So we're curious to hear from you what you find it easiest and hardest to measure. So thinking about that framework, early changes, systems changes, population changes, data on implementation or the conditions, and perhaps none of it is easy or none of it is hard. So we're going to start with easiest. Go ahead and just select one. Do you find one of these kinds of changes to be easiest to measure and to use that data in your work?
And Sarah, while folks are filling out the poll, just a note, if you could talk a little bit louder, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right.
I'll just leave the poll open for about 10 more seconds.
Great. All right, so we're seeing, it looks like a good portion of you think none of it is easy, and about the same number think that data on implementation and early changes are easiest to measure and use. So this may lead us into the next poll. Let's go ahead and look at the questions around what you find it hardest to measure. These might be the changes that are kind of stemming from some of those implementation efforts, changes to organizations, really looking to see that long-term goal changing, and maybe none of it. Oh, this should say none of it is hard. So if you want to change your answer really quick, you can get, none of it is hard. You find all of it easy. All right, so we're finding it hardest to measure systems changes, and not surprisingly, a little hard to look at those population level changes. Great, well, that's really helpful context as we go into these findings, and we'll be talking a bit more about system changes and ways that that might be helpful. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So while we have this very pretty simple model that we used in our study, we also partially just want to acknowledge that this is really messy and complicated work. So while we have some little boxes and arrows, in reality what we see are arrows going back and forth, different things, different conditions leading to different early changes, which lead to different systems changes. I also want to point out, as we looked at the sites where we dug in the deepest, we also looked at this purple box here on the bottom around alternate drivers. So those included other things that might lead to change, like barriers or facilitators in your particular setting, other kinds of programs and interventions that might be trying to achieve similar goals, to really interrogate what was it that led to the population change. Just two other things before we start to dig in. One is just to keep in mind with this study that this was really about looking at a couple of key changes that had been seen on the ground. We were not comprehensively evaluating everything about all the initiatives that we were looking into. So it may be helpful as you think about the findings that what we're really understanding are what led to a particular kind of population level change on the ground. The other thing to know going in is we're going to talk through the findings. We're going to actually kind of work from the right to the left. So I'll talk about population changes, then system changes and early changes before we move to the implementation of the conditions. All right, go ahead. So here are some of our highlights. So as Lauren mentioned, we had a lot of sites be nominated to be part of the study and ended up with 25. As she mentioned, population change was not one of the requirements to be part of the study. But when we ended up with our full sample, we did find, in fact, that 20 of them did have evidence of population change happening on the ground. And this occurred in a range of kind of issue areas, everything from the environment and education to juvenile justice and health. Go ahead to the next slide. So helpfully, there were 5 sites that did not have population change on the ground. And one thing that was interesting was that we were able to find some things that they had in common. These sites had shorter tenures, so they had been around for more like 5 to 7 years. The sites that I'll be talking the most about today and looking at the trajectory of their changes had been around on average of 14 years, and one had been around for more than 20 years. So it's really important to keep in mind that this takes time to really get to the population change on the ground. We also saw that they had less strong implementation of the collective impact conditions. And this is especially true in getting to a common agenda, which may not be so surprising, but was another sort of bit of evidence for us in understanding this contribution question. They also were having some challenges measuring the impact and had some other kind of issues about implementation on the ground that were a bit more idiosyncratic. So while it was helpful to know that 20 sites had population level change, this does not actually tell us whether collective impact contributed to those changes or not. So as Lauren mentioned, we dug deeper with 8 sites where we really went and talked to a range of stakeholders to get additional data to understand the change that had happened in their communities. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Among those 8, we were able to find that collective impact had undoubtedly contributed to those population changes. Go ahead and show the next part of the slide. So we did this by looking at those hypothesized connections between activities and outcomes and population change. And in looking at the connection between the systems change to the population change, we're able to find strong evidence of system changes that were critical to achieving those population level changes. So these included a lot of things around program services and practice improvements. This includes both providing and having greater access to things. So in Milwaukee, they were working on pregnancy prevention. They were able to get more evidence-based programs on the ground and available to individuals, as well as kind of program improvement things to make the services more effective. We saw some evidence of policy changes on the ground, and some of these were kind of small p policy, where people were working in schools, working on health and obesity prevention, and were able to see changes in things like beverage policies. And big P policies. So in Connecticut, they were working on juvenile justice and were able to see state-level policy change about how juvenile cases were handled within the court system. Really interestingly, across many of them, we saw an example of how leveraging resources differently was also a critical element to achieving the population level change. So in LA, there was a group working on homelessness. They were focused on veterans and the chronically homeless. They were able to get private and public money to be pooled together, to get a common application to really focus those dollars towards the area of greatest need that everyone was working toward, which made a huge difference in their effectiveness. So go ahead and change to the next slide. While it was interesting and important to know that we saw this strong kind of contribution stories among the 8 sites that we looked at most deeply, there were differences in what these stories looked like. So we found that 3 of the sites had what we called unique contribution stories, and 5 sites had contribution stories that were necessary but not unique. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I'll tell you a little bit more about both of these. So in those 3 sites, when we use the process tracing methodology, part of what you're looking for is the certainty with which the data holds up to scrutiny about the connections between the changes that you see, between those links in the chains, and the uniqueness with which the kind of components add to the change that you're looking for. And so we were able to see in a handful of sites that there was really no plausible alternative explanation for change, how change could have happened otherwise. So we saw that the population change had occurred, we were seeing strong data about the achievement of outcomes and their connection, and no other way to explain it. So one example of this was the Home for Good site I just mentioned with their sort of interesting funding model. So while they were part of bigger efforts that HUD had underway about changing things about data and systems, they were able to really work together, adopt common systems, adopt a common target, and really focus their efforts and have more consistency and have better handoffs between agencies. That was really making a difference far and above what you could explain by the HUD requirements alone. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We also found in the 5 sites that there was strong evidence that in the story of change for those communities, that there were critical points at which collective impact had made a difference in making that change happen. We had strong evidence about the data and the changes that were happening, but remember that little purple box I showed you earlier about the external drivers? In those sites, there were other drivers that made contributions to that change that meant the CI's unique contribution was different. It was contributing, but it was not sufficient to explain the change that happened. So a good example of this was school reform in Tennessee. There had been strong effort to support the strategic plan of the district and to really make kind of the school reform effort successful. But there were huge elements of kind of No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top money, the district efforts, the actual efforts that were happening within the school that were not specifically tied to collective impact exactly. So there was a really important part of that story that collective impact contributed to, but it was different than some of the other stories. Now, it is really important that you hear this part. Neither is better or worse. These are both important and valuable ways of leading to the kind of social change that collective impact initiatives are seeking. And I think it can actually be really helpful for the field to recognize that contribution can look different and that the role collective impact initiatives play can look different depending on what is happening in the community around it. So there were differences, and it's useful to know that, but one is not better than the other. All right, so now you know kind of the big headline story about this contribution question that was so important. But we want to share a few more things we found about system changes and early changes. So go ahead and go to the next slide. As we saw in the 8 sites we looked at more deeply, we also saw that system changes around new and expanded services and practice improvement were quite common among the 25 sites that we looked at. We also saw some similar patterns around policies and some other changes. In the report, if you're interested, we have a section in the back that looks at common changes for education initiatives and homelessness initiatives because we had a number of those in the study, so that may be of interest to you. Go ahead and change the slide. The next thing we saw was that there seemed to be a pattern about different kinds of system changes that were occurring. There are sort of 2 facets to this. Some changes are more informal. They can be experiments. They can be temporary things like communications campaigns. They can also happen sort of for one organization or for multiple organizations. And so what we really saw were examples of different kinds of system changes, and that it seemed helpful for people to recognize. A lot of you mentioned that this could be an area of challenge or an area of interest, that these different kind of system changes play different roles and have value at different times. So with the informal changes, we might see one organization doing a training or having a grant to do a one-time activity. Similarly, you might see a collaboration where people are really getting a chance to experiment with working together. You might see formal changes where you see an actual policy change in an organization. For example, when we saw the obesity prevention work in San Diego, there were child care centers that were adopting changes around activity and nutrition. We saw some changes that happened within a single organization that could actually ripple out across multiple organizations. So one example of this is sort of in a state education system, changing how it measures something like attendance or dropout rates, that change will actually lead to differences in how many systems are collecting data, what you're looking at and attending to. And of course, on the far right side of this, we have kind of formal changes across multiple organizations. Sometimes this means the same organizations are making the same kind of change. Home for Good is a good example of this again, in that all the agencies there agreed to make a change in sort of the data systems and the assessments they were using. So everybody was doing the same thing towards a common goal. In other cases, you might have many organizations coming together in unique but aligned ways. So we saw this in a site that was working on early childhood issues. They were developing a center in a priority neighborhood and had many organizations coming and bringing sort of their unique talents and skills and resources to the table in ways that were different but towards a common goal. So I find this helpful in, systems can be such an opaque term. It can be one that we throw around and we're all thinking different things as we say it. And so really having a way to think about what kind of changes might make sense is something that we hope will help people in their efforts and think about different ways that they might make progress in this area. So go ahead and go to the next slide. We have a quick poll for you again. We're curious about what types of systems changes you're seeking in your work. So having heard the examples we talked about, you see there are the informal changes and formal changes and across single organizations or many organizations. So we're curious. You can check all that apply. What kind of changes are you currently working on? All right, Jen, whenever you think we've gotten enough responses. All right, so a lot of you are working on the formal changes. Oh, that's so interesting. So more than half on formal changes across many organizations or across similar kinds of changes across organizations, and a lot of informal across multiple organizations. Really interesting. Really not totally surprising given this work, but still interesting to see how those patterns played out. Great, thanks for that. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So my last area of talking to you before we get to hear from you and you get to hear from some of my research colleagues is around some of the early changes we saw. So these are changes that may have come directly from the implementation of the CI condition. So things about building a common agenda, things around that kind of developing the structures and shared agenda and ways of working together. So not surprisingly, a lot of the sites, these are across all 25, were focused on changes in collaboration, a good amount focusing on sort of changes about visibility or framing of norms of issues and the quality of partnerships, and data availability or use. So these were common changes, and what we really saw as we looked at the data was these focused a lot on those early stages of building trust and building relationships to be able to set this work off on a strong foot. Go ahead to the next stage. Next slide. So what we saw when we looked at the connections between the conditions to early changes, we saw a lot about trust. When we looked at which kind of early changes were leading to system changes, we did see sort of a deepening of the focus on expanding and building upon those relationships, deepening the commitment and broader engagement across a wider array of partners. And so while that set of early changes I just showed you stayed consistent over time, kind of the nature of those changes evolved, as you might expect. So our last quick poll before we have some time for questions. So when you hear these kinds of early changes that we looked at in the study and saw across these 25 sites, to what degree does that resonate? Are you finding that this idea of a lot around kind of partnership quality, collaboration, data use, in your experience, is that very similar, a little, not at all, like your experience now? All right, a lot and some, great. It's always nice to hear that for those of you doing the work on the ground, you can see yourselves in these findings. All right, so we can go ahead and go to the next slide, which is really primarily a placeholder. I think the rest of my colleagues are going to come back on camera. We didn't want to distract you by looking at us all moving around along the way. And Jen, you're going to help moderate kind of questions that might be coming in for us before we move on.
Yes, thanks all, sending some great questions in. And so I will take a few of them before we turn to the next section of the presentation. So Terri, you were just talking about one of the early changes being around improved partnership quality. Can you talk a little bit about how you define a quality partnership?
Sure. Do you guys want to
go for that?
Sure.
Lauren, do you want to
Sure. Yeah, sure. So one of the pieces that we really looked at with regard to partnership quality was this aspect of trust. So a lot of collaborations would talk about having been able to establish greater trust among partnerships and really deepen those relationships. So we didn't predefine what it looked like to have a quality partnership. We looked at when people would tell us that that had happened, what that looked like. And so by and large, what that category included was these improved sort of interpersonal aspects of the relationship. So be that things of trust, quality, closeness, etc.
Yeah, and just to add quickly to that, I think that's differentiated from the collaboration, which is where you might look at the degree, the depth with which people are kind of working together as a difference from that more interpersonal relationship, as Lauren was just saying.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Another question, could you talk a little bit about how something like an informal experiment, like a training or a grant, is considered a system change?
Yeah, so I think it's looked at as a systems change because it's actually something that's happening within the organization to promote some difference of practice or policy. It's informal because it's often not institutionalized. They're piloting it, they're trying it out, they're learning from it, but it is a very early form of the system starting to change itself and think about different ways of interacting or being. And so we think of it as oftentimes those changes are much earlier in the process of systems change, as opposed to on the other end where we might see more formalized agreements or collaborations among organizations, et cetera.
All right, thank you. Another question, I wonder if the overall findings were different across sectors. So was it easier or harder, for example, to measure change between environmental versus social changes, or more or less success seen by sector?
I believe that so one of the things in our sample we really thought was diversity. We didn't want to have a study that focused too much on any one sort of model of implementation or one issue area. So I think it was hard for us to discern patterns by issue area because there was kind of that 25 spread quite a bit. I believe that we looked to see if there were any meaningful differences in outcome achievement and didn't find anything that stood out. I know there were a few interesting findings around one of the system changes related to infrastructure changes, and that was pretty narrowly attributed to things like environmental sites. I think there was one other kind of site, so actual changes in like sewage practices and that kind of thing. So I remember that standing out as sort of a small theme, but I think the nature of our study doesn't lend itself to kind of sweeping statements about sector areas. Is that, Lauren or Terri, do you have anything else to add?
I think that's right, and I think the other area was sort of the workforce development, economic development area, where you would actually change things like broadband access and other structures.
All right. So we're going to go back to a little bit of presentation. Please do keep sending questions. We have multiple pause points for Q&A, and I think we're handing it over to Lauren now.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the results that we found with regard to implementation of collective impact conditions. So when looking across the 25 study sites, we generally saw strongest implementation of the backbone support and the common agenda. Sites were more likely to have emerging or no implementation of the shared measurement and continuous communication elements of collective impact. So if you go to the next slide, you can see what we mean when we say strong implementation of a backbone, strong implementation of common agenda. So this is I'm referring back here to the rubrics that we developed as a component of our study. So these criteria about what it looked like to implement each of the conditions were developed and then refined over the course of the study. So they were developed based on guidance provided by the Collective Impact Forum, as well as, and then continue to be refined as we study collective impact implementation. So looking closely at what it meant to have a strong backbone, there were sort of two structural components of backbones that we looked at. One was the organization with the committed staff to perform core functions. The other one was a well-functioning leadership structure. So for example, steering committee that was responsible for governance and for decision making. With regard to backbone, it was important that there was infrastructure to support core initiative activities. This included guiding vision and strategy, convening stakeholders, supporting alignment and shared measurement practices, and mobilizing resources. It was also really important for backbones to have appropriate skills and credibility, both with partners and with communities and the populations that were directly affected by the issue. So what makes a strong common agenda then? So you can see there's also 4 bullets here. This includes a lot of different elements, including overarching goals and vision, as well as things like a common understanding of the problem, clearly articulated approach, and then a high level of buy-in around that shared vision for change. So why does it matter to have a strong backbone and common agenda? If you go to the next slide, in our study, these 2 collective impact conditions, backbone and common agenda, were frequently prioritized as drivers of changes to systems and population outcomes that Sarah discussed. We saw that backbones often play a critical role in convening partners, facilitating cross-sector collaboration, etc. Likewise, sites really described the importance of all getting on the same page in order to identify and move change forward. Another interesting piece here is that sites with more mature common agendas tended to see more systems changes that included policy change and changes to existing practices, along with systems change that required multiple organizations to shift their practice. So those multi-sector changes that Sarah mentioned. With regard to shared measurement, we saw, again, shared measurement was an area where sites were challenged. And when we looked at shared measurement, we not only looked at do sites have the agreed upon measures that they track over time? But we also looked at, is this system providing data that is useful, that is actionable? And so really the challenges for shared measurement centered around 3 buckets. The first is just data not being available. And I'm sure a lot of us who are working on these kind of initiatives, hopefully that resonates. The second is the types of indicators that they were examining. So often sites focused on long-term outcomes to provide data on usually their long-term population level impact. And while it's useful for examining progress, relying solely on long-term data as a part of a shared measurement system can be less useful for day-to-day decision making. And the third challenge really centered around a culture of data use and initiatives being able to cultivate that culture and integrate that into their work. So although it was difficult to implement, when present, shared measurement was really an important component of how change happened. Sites with those strong contribution stories included shared measurements in their explanation for how change happened. And so they tended to prioritize data-related early changes and systems change. The last piece I want to mention here is communication. When we looked at communication, we looked at both internal communication, sort of within the initiative, within the partners actively working on the initiative, as well as external communication. And that's really with those populations that are most directly impacted by the issues, the community sort of at large. So with regard to communication, the challenge is really centered around being able to implement communication mechanisms that were true feedback loops that allowed opportunities for input and modification of the work based on the information that was being received. So sites were really good at pushing information out. They weren't necessarily good about getting information and feedback back from people and then being able to modify the work based on that input and feedback. So if you go to the next slide, this is one of the visuals that we developed as a part of this study to help us think a little bit more about the relationship between the conditions. We really see the foundational elements, as I just mentioned, are the backbone and the common agenda. Those are sort of foundational to the work. Together, they really help and work together to facilitate mutually reinforcing activities and a shared measurement system. I was in a conversation with someone the other day, and we started talking about the fact that mutually reinforcing activities are really how you can tell whether or not you actually have a shared agenda. It's when you start to get to those activities where you can judge that level of alignment. So that's sort of where the rubber meets the road. It's the combination of the backbone and the common agenda to produce those pieces. The other piece I want to point out here is continuous communication. And it was generally less of a focus among the sites, as I mentioned, and it was treated largely as a function fulfilled by the backbone as a component of the backbone's work. So you can see that continuous communication is sort of nested underneath of the backbone. So we're going to move now to 2 polls before we open it up to questions on this section. The first is, which of the following collective impact conditions has been the most challenging for you to implement? And if this isn't a relevant question for you, you haven't started the work yet, et cetera, you can go ahead and just leave that one blank. So if we can go ahead and put that poll up there.
And we're having a little bit of technical difficulty with that poll. So if it's okay with you, if we could skip these polls, I think that's probably our best bet.
Okay. Maybe folks can just type those in if they have comments on that. The other thing we wanted to look at is which condition has been most impactful in helping to drive change. So we'll skip those for now and go to the next slide, where we really, again, just have a pause for any reflections or questions, either on the poll components or some other reflections, or really any questions on the implementation results.
Great. We have lots of folks typing into the question and chat boxes that things like common agenda. Some people are saying common agenda is easier, and some are saying it's really hard. And then we also have, you know, as I scan through this, it looks like most people, lots of different perspectives on the easiest and hardest, which is probably, you know, based very much on what's happening locally. I think a little bit of a trend around shared measurement being hard, for sure, and getting to mutually reinforcing activities. So thank you to those of you that are sharing that in the chat box. That definitely gives us a sense of where you are. So in terms of questions, let's see. Interesting question. Did the project specifically choose collective impact as their evaluation frame? We have a large-scale project with several collaborators all working in ways that really do reflect the collective impact conditions, but they haven't explicitly chosen that as their lens. They sort of fell into it. As the external evaluation team, the person asking the question has been recommended that they use collective impact as a frame to explore the outcomes. Do you have any thoughts on this?
So I can start off. So the explicit request of the study was to look at the collective impact approach. As I mentioned in the intro, that term started being used in 2011, and many folks, including those in our study, started out their work before that term was sort of officially coined. So they started out under, you know, just a different sort of collaboration framework, found that term useful, and then, you know, sort of adopted that as a lens through which to do their work. All of the sites in our study did have to, one, agree that they were doing collective impact, and then we assessed them sort of against those 5 conditions. So that was the frame for the study. With regards to the second part of the question about, is it a useful framework for the initiative that you're speaking about to adopt, I think it can be a really helpful frame for folks. So I think getting a better understanding of to what extent those elements are going to be, those conditions are going to be useful for advancing the work that your partnership is trying to do is something to think about explicitly. Certainly there are many models of collaboration, but our study didn't compare this model to other models.
Yeah, I'll just share one thing. One of our other colleagues on the study, Julia Lynn, had a really helpful analogy for thinking about this study as almost like a parenting book. You know, there's no recipe for being a good parent. There's no one way of doing things or knowing that you're going to be successful. And that this is really meant to be helpful. We think it does have applicability, whether you call yourself collective impact or not. There's a lot to learn about cross-sector partnership, sharing leadership, thinking about measurement that are applicable across a wider array. So I would sort of take this study in the spirit of it is one more bit of evidence and kind of way of understanding these kind of big collaborative efforts with these bigger, audacious kind of population level change goals.
Thank you. I think that you might have spoken to this earlier, but could you reiterate what the average time duration of the initiatives were in the study?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we had, our minimum was 3 years, and I think most of our initiatives ran between the 5 and 10 years amount of time. We actually had some that were in the 15. Of them fell in that middle range.
The 8 sites for which we did the deeper dive analysis and data collection, I think on average were 14 years. And I may have compared to the overall study. I see Lauren flipping. I think all of us use our little report as our Bible. So I think I can speak to the 8 sites versus the overall sample. But yeah, I think the range was between fears and the sure.
All right. Let's see. Is there any tension that you notice between backbone entity and leadership and shared leadership?
That's a really good question, and we'll dig into that a little bit probably with the next section, which is equity. But yes, I think one of the areas that we did find was that the backbone was often seen as the driver and the leader, and the initiatives often had a little bit of a challenge in engaging leadership outside of that backbone. There were many initiatives, though, that did some interesting things in terms of their work groups by having work group leads that were community members or community organization members or co-leads between backbone staff and community groups or staff within particular organizations. But we did hear from folks that so that inclusive leadership was a bit of a challenge in terms of people being able to both have the time and resources to engage at that level, but also in terms of engaging the communities that they were working in.
One part of the study that we don't talk as much about in all of the facets we looked at in the study were digging into some of the principles of practice and trying to start to understand how those were playing out across some of these different sites. And so there are some interesting kind of process findings about leadership and cross-sector partnership and some of the data used. The equity we dug into with a particular focus. But there were some interesting things, as Terri said, about the work groups, but also where people were trying to build the capacity of other leaders and how to think about leadership transitions. And I think we're feeling most successful when it was able to, that sense of leadership was able to be expanded beyond any one kind of person or organization.
Yeah, and this is Jen from the Collective Impact Forum. As Sarah just mentioned, what we have really seen is that the backbone, it's super important that the backbone doesn't assume all of the leadership responsibility on their own and drive the agenda, but rather facilitates that on behalf of the broader group and community. And so I think, as Sarah just mentioned, working towards that shared leadership governance structure it sort of underpins what we have seen in the field of practice. I'm not sure if this is a question you all looked at, but someone is curious who provided most of the backbone work: government agencies, nonprofits, a mix?
This is a question we get a lot, and we are excited to do further analysis to look at the types of backbones and sort of if that relates to any of the other components. In our study, we did see quite a range of different backbone organizations, including backbones that were funders, backbones that were not funders, government, nonprofit, et cetera. So there were quite a different range. We haven't done an analysis through a lens of what implications that has had on different pieces yet. But it's definitely a question that we've gotten a couple times and I think is something we're going to dig back into.
Great. Just so folks on the line know, several people have asked if this is being recorded and if there are slides available. This is being recorded and there will be a link sent out after. In addition, the slides are available both on the Collective Impact Forum website as well as they are actually available now in real time in the handout section on your GoToMeeting app on the right side. So I wanted to let everyone know because that question came in several times. Another question was, are the rubrics available? And Sarah, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So one of the things that we hope to do as some follow-up to the study is build those out, that we could do some testing of them now that we have data from the 25 sites, refine them a little bit, package them so they're useful to people who aren't people on the research team. If you look at the full report in the back, we actually put a lot of information about our methods and approaches in there, so you could see what some of the elements within the rubric are. And so that would be a good starting point and a way to get sort of a head start at looking at that while we're waiting to kind of create a tool that will be more useful for the field.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions before we go on to our next section. So let's see. When the site did not have a strong measurement system, how did you measure system or population level change?
So that's a good question. We did rely on sites to determine and provide us with evidence of population level change. So this could have been as a part of their shared measurement, or could have been as a part of a population level study that they conducted, for example. So any population level data, we relied and then assessed the quality in terms of reliability, validity, et cetera, of that data based on the data provided by the site in some format. In terms of systems change, we actually developed a rubric and a definition of systems change ourselves. And so we identified systems change through the interviews, the document review, the other data collection methods with the site, and then categorize what they were describing to us of things that had changed, things they had implemented, et cetera. We categorized those as systems change ourselves. I will say that the majority of shared measurement systems did not have an explicit way to capture or track systems change. And I think that's sort of what I was trying to get at a little bit in my comments about if you're only tracking those long-term population outcomes, it can be difficult to have data that allows you to adjust and be nimble and sort of make mid-course corrections. So thinking a little bit more holistically about what kinds of things are included in a shared measurement system is definitely for me an important study finding.
Great. In an earlier slide, communication was called an early change, and then you also talked about continuous communication. For either or both, could you clarify whether you're talking about internal communication amongst partners and or external marketing PR type communication?
So, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Lauren.
I was going to say, so for communication, as a CI condition, it included both internal and external communication as a way to talk about the work of the initiative. If there was a external communications campaign, like a marketing campaign, a public relations sort of engagement event or strategy, that was something different that wasn't included as a part of a continuous communication collective impact condition. So that's one of the big differences.
Great. Another question around how do you measure trust between partners?
Yeah, for the purposes of this study, I think as Lauren mentioned before, we had asked folks about the partnership and the quality of the partnership and did some thematic analysis as they referred to things about partners trusting each other more credibility, between partners and those sorts of things. So it was more of a qualitative thematic approach of trying to identify what trust looked like and taking what the initiatives were telling us about the relationships that they were experiencing.
We had a little bit more stakeholder engagement with the 8 sites that we did the deeper dives with, which helped bring more perspectives to the table. So we didn't independently assess the degree of trust between partners, but we were able to hear from more people how they were talking about the important outcomes and what led to what. And so some of that deeper data where we got to hear from more people, that we saw similar patterns in the broader data set, which really came from a couple of interviews, gave us some increased confidence and understanding of what those things meant that we didn't sort of independently verify.
Yeah, I think one just piece to add there quickly related to trust was as a part of the site visits, we really intentionally structured different dialogues where we looked to hear from, some of the community partners directly, sort of in a safer space. And so being able to understand their perspectives on the backbone in terms of trust and credibility was something that we got to dive into a little bit deeper as well, which I think to see how much, like Sarah said, those perspectives sort of align.
All right, thank you, team. Let's now turn back to the next section of the presentation before we hop back over to questions.
All right, Robert, if you'll go ahead and change the slide to the next one. As Sarah referred to just a little bit ago, we did do some investigation into some of the principles of practice that the collective impact approach is implementing. And one of those that we looked just deeper dive into was the area of equity. As social change has been occurring, there are lots and lots of systems in play that can create barriers that don't allow for equitable outcomes or equitable access. And so in terms of the sort of the collective impact approach, there is this sense that if you can remove those systems or create systems that do more equitable pathways or more equitable access, that you can actually address some of these issues for folks that are not equally benefited by the system itself. So we wanted to look at, because of this movement towards more of an equitable perspective in the field, and more of a realization that in order to move the needle overall, you need to really be targeted and focused on the individuals and groups that need the most support. We wanted to dig a little bit deeper on the equity question. It's a question I think that the forum gets lots and lots of questions about. It's something that we're seeing a movement in the field towards in terms of creating equitable opportunities, equitable outcomes, and benefits for lots of folks. In terms of the study itself, we wanted to have a framework that would allow us to look at different aspects of equity. And also, we also knew that we were not going to be able to sort of get into this deep structural analysis of those systems and changes, et cetera, root causes, et cetera, in terms of the study, but we did want to descriptively try to understand how equity looks within collective impact. And so on this slide, you can see this is the sort of the guiding definition that we used. It is really about assessing disparities and opportunities and outcomes with this lens of being caused by structures and institutions and systems, and addressing those disparities through meaningful inclusion, representation, and having institutional structures that change to promote more access and opportunity. So as Lauren was talking about earlier about the methods for the study, we also used a rubric for this aspect of the study to really look at some different components of equity. If we go to the next slide, we're going to do a little bit of a poll here to kind of let you think about equity work for yourself. So if you think about your own equity work in your initiative, where are you currently in terms of your thinking and your implementation around equity in your own initiative? Is it what's equity? What do you mean by that? To having a very kind of deep, infused perspective that permeates your work.
All right, I'll close the poll in about 10 seconds.
Great, this is very interesting. It looks like a lot of folks are having meaningful representation, getting some equity outcomes in systems and populations, building capacity, taking action. So it seems like that there's a lot of work happening across all of those. So if we could go on to the next slide, we'll start.
Terri, I was just going to mention that the way the poll was worded here was the areas that are the most challenging in folks' work.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Sorry, yeah, so it looks like there's lots of challenge going on, which I think is resonant with what we found in the study. So if we can go on to the next slide. In the rubric that we developed for this study, we looked at several different dimensions. We looked at 3 dimensions, which we called equity-focused actions, and those are capacity to engage in equity, targeted actions, and sort of meaningful inclusion and representation. And so we looked at the degree to which the 25 sites that we were studying were demonstrating these 3 different components. So if you think about equity capacity is the capacity to engage in action. So it's a sort of preconditions that need to be in place in order for the initiative to really engage in this equity work. So it includes things like the explicitness of your focus. So is there an intention to engage in equity? Is the initiative engaged in capacity building activities that can help build support and the skills for partners within the initiative to engage in this? Is there a shared language of equity, and is there some credibility in terms of the leaders and the backbone in the community that can support equity-focused work? So if you look at this slide, about a third of the sites were rated as having pretty strong equity capacity in terms of being really intentional about their work, having engaged in capacity activities, having shared language, et cetera. A really good example of a site that's really strong in this is K-Connect, which is a Cradle to Career initiative, and they have done a really good job of being very, very explicit about their equity framework. They have a equity action plan. They have equity advisors for all of their work groups. Their website is framed in terms of equity, and they have done an extensive amount of sort of capacity building and training. So that's an example of a site that is pretty strong in the capacity realm. The second dimension under equity-focused actions is this idea of targeting action. And so what this really means is that initiatives that are strong in this are ones that are using data to disaggregate and understand where the needs are, targeting their interventions and their solutions towards those of greatest needs, building on community assets, and really trying to dig deep in terms of the root causes of that inequity. So it's really about framing the work around a really targeted set of activities that can meet the needs of those that are most in need. So, you know, an example of this would be, for example, Project U-Turn, which is a opportunity youth initiative in Philadelphia. And they do a really nice job of having pretty extensive data disaggregations where they really look deeply at different pockets of the student population that they're serving. They have an opportunity youth network approach with the district and with the schools where all of the actions are targeted towards supporting those youth. They also build on the community assets that the youth live in terms of creating solutions, so looking at what resources are in the community, engaging parents, et cetera. And they also really do something that a lot of sites are not really doing, which was to really dig deep on what are the root causes of these disparities that are happening for these youth. So things like looking at the funding structures across schools, looking at the economic characteristics of neighborhoods, and trying to understand sort of structurally why the inequities are happening so that they can create solutions that are more systems based to change. Again, we saw about a third of our sites that were pretty strong with this, about a third of them who are emerging. They're developing ways to think about targeted actions. And so that, you know, this is something that folks are really starting to think about, and it's playing out over time. The third element that we looked at was this idea of meaningful inclusion and representation, which is really about empowering the communities who are the beneficiaries of these collective impact initiatives. It's about shifting power. It's about having representation on leadership and the work of those folks with lived experience and who are benefiting from these initiatives. And so this was where we found the most challenge. Most of the initiatives that we talked about this as a significant challenge and how to really authentically engage the community, how to shift that power, how to bring folks on board. And so this was an area where that seemed to be more of a challenge than the other two areas. If we go to the next slide. Okay. Yeah. We did try to, while our study really didn't support the idea of what causes what. So if you are strong in your equity capacity, do you automatically, does that cause population or systems changes? We were able to look at some descriptive relationships. And so there were some things that came out of our analysis that suggest, how the different components of equity work together to promote systems, equity-focused systems change and equity-focused population change. So first, capacity is positively associated with actions and representation. So the more capacity that your initiative has to engage in equity, that is, the more intentional that you are, the more focused, the more shared language, and the more capacity you're building, the more likely you are to have targeted actions that are addressing the needs of those that are most in need, and you have more engagement. So that just, those sites that had high capacity also tended in some ways to have higher targeted actions and representation. On the other hand, when we looked at the relationship between action and meaningful inclusion, there didn't seem to be as strong of a relationship there. And we saw this with several of our sites where they were working with specific populations. So their focus of their work was, for example, with chronic or veteran homelessness, or with economically depressed regions where they were trying to build the economic well-being of a particular region that was under duress. And so all of their actions were targeted to those populations, but they didn't really have very strong inclusion or representation in terms of making decisions about those strategies. So we saw that those things didn't necessarily coexist together. We also saw that equity commitment, so this idea of capacity and action and inclusion, wasn't really related directly to population change. So having this equity focus doesn't automatically translate into population change. What seems to happen, though, is that the stronger the equity focus is, the more likely that you are to engage in these systems changes that are going to open pathways, increase access, increase opportunities, which are then going to lead to these population changes. So it's almost like it plays more of an indirect role through the systems changes to get to population change. So that was one of the things that we found. So if you go on to the next slide, we also kind of looked at overall the relationship between equity actions and the different kinds of outcomes. And we had our sites, all 25 sites, kind of divided up into 4 different groups. The first group was this group you can see here. If you look at this chart, this represents 7 of the sites. And the darker the color, the stronger, or the more of a certain thing is in place. So the very dark purples mean that there's a strong capacity, there's a strong set of targeted actions or strong representation. If you look at the pink, the darker the pink, the stronger the systems change, or the more systems change related to equity-focused systems is occurring. And then the orange, if there are darker orange, that means that they are seeing population change that's equity-focused. And what we mean by that is it's reducing gaps, increasing opportunities, et cetera. So it's not just looking at whole population, it's looking at reducing the gaps between different groups. So if you look at this, you can see that there are a set of sites that are pretty strong with equity actions and focus that are producing a lot of systems changes and a lot of population changes. There's one on this table that, if you look at the one from the bottom, it's not seeing a lot of population change. And while that's a very strong equity-focused initiative, it was also an initiative that was having a lot of trouble with getting the collective impact conditions implemented. And when we talked with them a little more deeply about that, they felt like their lack of progress was really about getting common agenda going and having the backbone have consistent support and those sorts of things. So that's a little bit of why that looks that way. If you go to the next slide, we had a good chunk of our sites that were what we called in this emerging equity bucket of how they were thinking about equity. A lot of these sites had either just recently started to think about implementing equity, and so they were in the very early stages of exploring what that meant. So they might be thinking about engaging consultants to come in and help them build capacity. They might be working together to come up with a common and shared definition or a common explicit focus. They are making strides towards engaging and including differently than they were before, but they are not as far along the continuum on those things. And not surprisingly, you can see that these sites are also seeing less systems change and less population change, although it's more variable. So some are seeing stronger systems changes, some are seeing a little bit stronger population changes, but we think of these as our emerging sites, these sites that are either starting the process now or are not as strong in implementing this over time, but are really starting to try to make some efforts around this. Our third and fourth group are those that are what we think of as that are not as strong with their equity focus, and they kind of fall into two buckets. We have the group at the bottom, which were the sites where equity was really not on the radar, and some of this is about the topic area. So, for example, one of these sites is an environmental site where they aren't thinking about equity in the ways that we traditionally think about it as decreased opportunities or gaps. They're really thinking about, for example, improving the quality of the entire river. So they're not even thinking about disaggregating in that way. So these bottom sites are ones that really weren't thinking very much about equity, and they really weren't seeing a lot of changes that were equity focused. The top group, where you see the bright oranges, were actually groups that were seeing some population changes that could be defined as equity focused. So I talked a little bit earlier about the sort of targeting the chronic and veteran homeless. Some of the sites were really seeing population change because their targeted actions towards those were producing changes. But I think it's really important to kind of note, if you're thinking about this equity as a holistic approach that requires not just the population change and the targeted actions, but also has these other components of capacity and representation, these sites are also sort of low equity action sites as well. We go to the next slide. So here's a poll. And this one, I think, that was technical difficulties with that one too. So
yes, I went earlier.
Yeah. So I think I would just turn it back to Jen and see if we have questions around this area.
We do. So we'll take a few equity-related questions. Then I know you have just a couple more slides you were going to speak to, and then we'll take a few more general questions in our remaining time. So one person asked, did you create the definition of equity, or if not, could you tell us the source for the definition you used in framing the equity work?
Yeah, so the source, I believe, is in the report, and it came from a combination of the Collective Impact Forum's thinking about equity and some writing that Junius Williams did around what does equity mean, and I think we've sourced it in the report, but we can certainly share that citation with folks if they're interested.
Sure, and Junius Williams is from the previous leader of Urban Strategies Council in Oakland, California, in case you are curious where that comes from. Someone asked, I'm wondering if the outcomes discussed in the equity section, so what you have called the equity outcomes, are outcomes related to equity or outcomes overall, or equity-specific outcomes around closing disparities?
They were equity-specific outcomes, so we defined them. What we did was that when we were looking at population change for each of the sites, we actually classified the population change itself, and then we also coded it for whether it was equity-focused. Was it reducing a gap? Was it increasing an opportunity? So the population change got changed as a population, coded as a population change happened, and or it was equity focused. And it was considered to be a equity focused population change if the gap was actually closing.
Okay, great, thank you. One more question was asked that I'm just gonna, so someone noted that all of today's presenters do appear to be white women. Was there diversity among the study researchers? Could someone speak to that, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. And it's a fair question and a good question. I'm glad it got asked. So you might not be surprised to hear it took a small army of us to implement the study. So it was not just the three of us doing all this work. And we did have men and we did have people of different backgrounds as part of those teams. We did also have some intentionality around our advisory group and our steering group, which are some of the bodies that Lauren spoke to at the beginning that were representing some different points of view, different backgrounds, and implementation point of view versus kind of vendor point of view. So we did have some attention to that within kind of the implementation of the work on our side as well. So it is not in evidence today.
Thank you, Sarah. One more question, and I will speak to this and then ask the research team as well before we turn to our last section, is what do you see as the next stage of research related to equity and inclusion? And I will say that that is definitely a priority for the Collective Impact Forum. That was one of many questions in this research project, and the sites for this study were not selected with the specific intention of studying the equity questions that have been surfaced today. So while there's lots of there is data and some conclusions that were shared today, we definitely see an opportunity for deeper and greater research on this topic where the effort is squarely focused on looking at the equity, the progress of implementation and outcomes related to equity. I don't know if anyone on the study team would like to comment.
I agree. I think this has been a topic that we've been having a lot of conversations about because we feel like we just touched the tip of the iceberg. The study was, originally designed to answer the question about contribution to population assistance change, and we did do a little bit deeper dive in terms of the equity conversation, but there are a lot of things that we weren't able to go deeply on. What is it? What are the ways that initiatives can really do meaningful inclusion? What does it mean to have equity, capacity, and credibility in the community? Does it make a difference if you're a grassroots organization that looks like the community doing the work as opposed to sort of a more top-down, funder-driven model? So I think there are lots and lots of questions that we are really interested in following up as well.
I think just the last thing I'll add quickly that came up at the forum's annual conference was a little bit of this kind of cognitive dissonance of how can people have focus on equity but not be working on root causes. And so I think there's something interesting to think about. What does that work look at that's really trying to get beyond, better efficiency? And I think we have a bit of a hypothesis that you're going to max out some of those equity outcomes if you don't start to address some of the bigger systemic issues that might be at play. So I think that's an area of interest as well.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it back for the last few slides, and then we'll close it out.
All right. You go to the next slide. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about implications, and there are, if you read the report, there are, implications for various audiences. We have implications for implementers, we have implications for funders and community members, and we've added some of those slides in here. And we have a handout that we can also send to you that has these different pieces to it. But in general, there are 4 implications that we sort of raised at the end of the report. And the first one is that collective impact is a long-term investment. And so it is really important, I think, given that it's a long-term investment, to really focus on getting the foundation in place. And as Lauren talked about, for example, some of the foundation is spending the time to get the right backbone and have the backbone have the right capacities, spending the time to have common agenda and bringing the right people around the table, having the time to really define the problem space and the target population so that your work is very much targeted that way. So this idea, it's long-term and it is really worthwhile to set the foundation up front. The second implication that we raised has to do with the idea of systems change. As Sarah talked about, there are lots and lots of different kinds of systems changes that happen. Systems change is often iterative. You may have a early change that leads to a systems change that leads to another early change, and there's no one pathway through systems. So it's really important to kind of think about the goals of the initiative and think about which systems are going to be the highest leverage points for change to meet the goals that you have, and really to try to focus on those, but to know that there are multiple pathways through the systems that can change. The third implication that we really raised up was the issue of equity. Equity is hard. Equity is challenging. It also can take various forms, and so I think the implication there is to just be really aware of the perspectives and the frame around equity for partners and for the backbone, to be intentional and to be adaptive. So it's not something that you can sort of lay out the pathway and expect it to just go from point A to point B, that there might be lots of things that you need to be thinking about. And then finally, the fourth implication is that, and this goes back to what Sarah was talking about with the contribution work, was that collective impact can have an impact in a variety of ways. So it can be that the initiative has a direct impact in terms of changing things. The initiative could be leveraging existing work, or it could be sort of enabling, helping enabling conditions, working within this environment of helping enabling conditions really produce the outcomes. But it can be have that impact in a variety of ways. Lauren and Sarah, are there any kind of last comments you'd like to make before we turn it over for questions?
No, I'd love to take it, not from my end. I would just say, as Terri mentioned, we have implications in these same areas for evaluators and for community participants and funders. So just know that those are a resource that's available for you.
Great. We have unfortunately lots of questions that we weren't able to get to with over 400 people on the line. The team from Spark and ORS has graciously offered to take questions that if you'd have any that you would like to send them by email. Do we have your email addresses on the screen, or does one of you want to just offer it up right now to be sure that that's possible?
Sure. All right, I just posted it. It might be, if you don't mind reposting.
Sure. It's for Terri can field questions at TAKEY, Terri Akey at orsimpact.com. So thank you for that, Terri. I don't think that we have time for any more of the questions that have come in, but I definitely want to take a moment to thank Sarah, Terri, Lauren, and the army of researchers that joined you in doing this work for a year-long study that really has helped to advance the research base around the topic of collective impact. So thank you so much. Robert, I just have a few closing slides that we can turn to. So there were lots of great questions also around the implementation of collective impact that came in before or during this session. We want to point you to some existing resources on the collectiveimpactforum.org. And the great place to start is the Getting Started section. Again, this webinar and the slides and summaries of the different components of the findings are also all available on collectiveimpactforum.org. And Robert, let's go to the next slide. And finally, we wanted to share some upcoming learning opportunities as well if you're interested in diving deeper on this or other topics. We have another free webinar that is related to the topic of openness amongst the funder philanthropic community. That webinar is happening on June 12th. For the research study itself, we will be doing a series of what we call virtual coffee chats over the next few months, where our Collective Impact Forum team does conversations with some of the sites that were part of the research study to hear from them more about their experience on some of the different topics that came up. So topics like sustaining collective impact work over time, or looking for early changes in your work, or building shared leadership. So stay tuned for the details on how to join those virtual coffees. And then finally, for those of you that are practitioners interested in a much deeper dive of in-person learning opportunity, we'll be hosting a workshop in October in Los Angeles that is designed specifically for those folks playing the Backbone staff to go deeper, both as a training and also to connect with other Backbone leaders doing this work and meet some peers knee-deep in this work like you. So stay tuned for more information on all of these. And with that, we want to say a sincere thank you for joining us today and to the research team. We wish everyone a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.